In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a revenue law that levied a tax on all trade deals. The attempt to introduce the tax provoked discontent and disturbances among the inhabitants of Boston and other colonial towns. Fierce resistance to the tax forced the British government to repeal the Stamp Act. However, shortly after, the Parliament imposed new duties and sent regular troops to discourage any rebellion. This led to the famous Boston Massacre, where British troops fired on the crowd, killing several men. In 1773, British ships delivered a huge shipment of tea to Boston. This time, the Parliament had abolished the duty on tea imported to America, but had left a small tax in place. The colonists, however, continued to refuse the rights of the Parliament to tax them. A group of Bostonians, disguised as Native Americans, boarded the vessels and emptied the tea into Boston Harbor. The locals called this event the Boston Tea Party. As punishment, the British government ruled that Boston Harbor be closed for trade, causing resentment and rebellion in 13 British colonies. The Boston Tea Party was followed by unrest. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress was held, and the representatives sent the king one last plea, which became known as the Olive Branch Petition. They later ruled to form an American army and appointed 43-year-old George Washington as its commander-in-chief. In response, the king declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion and ordered the revolt to be suppressed. The war began with a skirmish between the Lexington farmers and British troops. A squad of 700 entered Lexington to face the badly organized rows of militiamen. There were less than 70 of them, and a British officer offered to let them go home before it was too late. But a shot provoked the British into firing a volley, which killed 8 and injured 10 colonists. By noon, they had entered Concord. Meanwhile, news of the outrage in Lexington had spread around the neighborhood. On their way back to Boston, the British were ceaselessly enfiladed by the rebels who lay ambushes along the road. As a result, the Concord Campaign cost the lives of 273 British and 95 Americans. The first serious battle took place at Bunker Hill near Boston in June 1773. The British, under General William Howe, launched an assault at Breed's Hill. There could be no doubt that the British troops were far better trained than the colonists. Thus, Howe expected the rebels to withdraw as soon as they saw the closed ranks of redcoats coming up the hill. However, the Americans successfully repelled 2 attacks, and only after they had run out of ammunition were the British able to end the battle with bayonets. About 1,000 men were killed or wounded on the British side, while only 100 colonists were killed and 300 injured. It became clear that entirely new tactics were required. At the meeting of the colonial governors in Philadelphia on the 4th of July, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted, an official agreement through which America was proclaimed an independent country. A decision was also reached to form a regular army under the command of George Washington. At the time of the Second Continental Congress, Washington was unanimously voted Commander-in-Chief of all American military forces. The British continued the offensive. In 1777, General John Burgoyne left Canada and headed for Albany, planning later to join the New York garrison. At the same time, General Howe moved his troops into Philadelphia. He confronted Washington in an unequal battle and defeated him, capturing the town. However, this important British victory was overshadowed by the brilliant triumph of the Americans in the battle at Saratoga, a New York colony. In a series of violent clashes, the colonial forces stopped and surrounded the British army en route from Canada. In October 1778, Burgoyne was forced to surrender. This decisive battle put an end to the British offensive and marked the end of one stage of the war. France had been looking for a way to undermine the British position in North America since 1763. In 1775, the French granted a loan of 1 million livres to the colonies. Fearing that Britain would offer peace to the Americans after the defeat at Saratoga, the French hastened to take on the obligation of fighting for American independence. In February 1778, they signed an agreement. The war for the independent Canadian colony and its capital Quebec had not long ended, and France didn't want another increase of the British influence in North America. However, despite the help of the French, the war dragged on. It was George Washington's authority and firmness that prevented his troops from revolting and rioting. For 3 years, Britain had tried to capture vast territories in the South and restore the power of the Crown. Initially, they succeeded. Georgia was reoccupied by the British in 1779. Charleston was captured in early 1780, and North Carolina in the fall of the same year. However, the French fleet was able to deploy troops in the eastern ports of America, which secured regular European troops and volunteers for the American Army. The British Army in North America was too small to continue the occupation. In the end, the main forces of the American Army, supported by 5,000 French troops and the fleet, surrounded the enemy at Yorktown, Virginia in October 1781. Some 14,000 strong American and French troops, significantly superior in number, laid siege to the British positions. Recognizing the hopelessness of putting up a resistance, Cornwallis requested a truce on October 17th and signed the surrender 2 days later. The British opposition had broken down. In 1783, they signed the Treaty of Paris, whereby the colonies were accorded independence. As a result of successful military operations, Britain acknowledged the sovereignty of the American colonies. In 1783, they were forced to sign the Paris Peace Treaty, according to which the United States obtained their independence. After the end of the war, George Washington was elected the first president of the USA by an overwhelming majority. Washington took up the post on April 30th, 1789, and was re-elected in 1792. Under Washington, the territory of the state expanded fast. As a result of a deal with Spain, the borders of the U.S. and Spanish colonies followed the 31st parallel, which created excellent conditions for the conquest of the Wild West. In 1791, Vermont, a new northeastern state, was annexed. Kentucky followed in 1792, and Tennessee in 1796.